Welcome to the debate. Today, we're tackling a really fundamental challenge facing interdisciplinary research, or ID. Now, we both definitely agree that ID work has to be, well, scientific, rigorous, and capable of addressing these incredibly complex issues it sets out to solve. That's sort of the baseline.
Absolutely. I mean, the need for systematic, comprehensive analysis is it's non-negotiable, especially if we want ID to be, taken seriously as a proper intellectual enterprise.
Right. So the real question that's kind of hanging over us is, how do we actually do that rigor? Should the pursuit of interdisciplinary integration be, let's say, governed by a structured, concrete, multi-step process, almost like a scaffolding that gives clarity and a necessary common framework for the whole community of scholars?
Does the highest form of synthesis really rely on those flashes of insight, experiential knowledge, and emergent discoveries that, well, they inherently resist being reduced into formal rules or checklists? I'm firmly staking my claim on that latter view. Prescriptive rules, I think, are just inadequate to capture the generative, sometimes messy, nature of discovery.
See, I'm going to argue that structure is utterly essential. My position really supports having a structured, multi-step guide, something like the 12 steps proposed by Newell and Klein, which were designed, as they said, to be more concrete and more inclusive. This kind of framework provides the guardrails, the necessary ones to turn a brilliant hunch into verifiable scholarly work. It's a guideline the entire community can actually rely on.
I just don't buy that framework as the primary guide. Look, while these models might be useful for reflection or maybe organizing a syllabus, I really think they fail to characterize the actual process of integration, that intellectual leap needed to connect to disparate fields. You just can't force that into a chronological checklist. It's fundamentally a generative and emergent process, something that happens outside the neat little steps.
But that generative spark needs to be harnessed, doesn't it? That's precisely why the structured approach is, well, non-negotiable for scholarly accountability. By adopting a clear, multi-step process, we alert researchers to the, quote, dangers of omitting steps. And when you're dealing with enormous complexity, you absolutely need that accountability. Specifying the steps precisely allows ID research to be held to its own standards, regardless of the disciplinary background of the researcher involved. And crucially, this framework demands precision right in the early stages. For instance, the requirement to clearly identify key phenomena involved in Step 2, and then ascertain relevant theories and methods in Step 3. This ensures we're not just falling back on disciplinary habits. By using detailed classifications of phenomena, theory, methods, the framework actively forces breadth. It stops researchers from unconsciously ignoring important insights just because, well, those insights have been historically neglected by their home discipline. It forces intentionality.
Okay, that's a compelling argument for setting up community metrics, maybe. But I'd frame the utility of this model quite differently. I really see these steps mainly as a post hoc check-in, a way to clean up and present the findings for an external audience, rather than an accurate map for the actual journey of discovery itself. I mean, consider my own published ID work, Fractals or Fish. The breakthrough there wasn't driven by ticking off a chronological list. It was propelled by an intuitive insight that stemmed from a persistent observation, almost a catchy phrase, a mantra that kept reoccurring until it forced these two disparate systems together in my mind. I'll freely admit I skipped the detailed literature survey, what's often called Step 4, and I certainly didn't systematically list out every key phenomenon, Step 2, before I started trying to synthesize.
My insight came from spotting these implicit Euclidean assumptions buried in a legal text, which then, quite unexpectedly, led me to the relevance of fractal geometry. So if I tried to retroactively force that genuinely generative process into your framework, I immediately run into conceptual problems. The core integration step, which your model labels Step 9, develop a more comprehensive integrative analysis, it's just so vague for someone who hasn't done it before that it's almost paralyzing. Saying develop a more comprehensive analysis, it's a bit like telling a musician, okay, now write a symphony. I mean, yes, technically correct, but it offers zero usable how-to guidance on the actual intellectual mechanics of synthesis. How can a prescriptive rule possibly capture the essence of emergence, the appearance of something genuinely new and unexpected?
I see why you might think the structure limits that spark, but I think perhaps you're conflating the initial creative flash with the rigorous process that's absolutely required to test, verify, and ultimately integrate that flash into cumulative knowledge.
But surely the two are inextricably linked. I mean, if we look at post-positivist philosophy of science, the whole idea of how knowledge is generated shifts away from pure, simple deduction. You have Polanyi talking about creative imagination and the tacit dimension, that internalized, almost pre-conscious knowledge that just resists being articulated through formal steps. And even Popper, right, when discussing the logic of scientific discovery, he noted that hypotheses themselves often emerge from hunches, intuition, even dreams. So if science itself, arguably the most logical, rule-bound discipline cluster we have, is fundamentally dependent on these intuitive moments for its big generative breakthroughs, then ID, which is so often tackling pre-paradigm complexity, well, it must be even more resistant to being rigidly reduced to logical steps or rules. The real innovation happens when we allow for that intuitive, sometimes chaotic exploration.
Okay, I fully acknowledge the power of creative imagination. That aha moment is real. I grant you that. But it's simply not sufficient for scholarship. Structure is required precisely for scholarly verification and critical evaluation. The framework provides the necessary tools to perform systematic evaluation, particularly in Step 7, which requires us to evaluate the results of previous research. And this step, it's really an epistemological tool. It demands that we assess how disciplinary perspectives, that's Step 5, influence the research we're looking at. It forces us to critique results based on a robust, general understanding of the strengths and weaknesses inherent in different theories and methods. So intuition might give you the insight, yes, but a structured approach, a conscious checklist, if you will, of biases, methodological weaknesses, theoretical limitations, that gives you the scholarly credibility needed for the finding to actually survive critique.
Without something like Step 7, how do we even differentiate authentic insight from, say, mere disciplinary speculation?
Right? That's a strong argument for the necessity of verification. I see that. But doesn't your structure, by mandating these specific guardrails, inadvertently define the boundaries of the investigation before the real novelty has even had a chance to appear?
Actually, I'd argue quite the opposite. The process is specifically designed to manage complexity by forcing researchers to actively address the gaps that individual disciplines habitually ignore. Look at the function of Step 6. It explicitly instructs researchers to perform or encourage research on relevant phenomena, links, theories, or methods that have received little or no attention. Now, this step isn't just some tedious checklist item. It's an epistemological intervention. It forces us to acknowledge those disciplinary blind spots, transforming ID research from just a synthesis of what we already know into a targeted search for what's been habitually ignored. So the framework actually embraces the unexpected by providing guidance on how to begin filling those voids between established knowledge clusters. And, the goal isn't necessarily for one single scholar to master every step in isolation, but for the community to collectively ensure rigor and completeness, making sure the enterprise as a whole is robust.
I'm still not convinced you can really plan for the unexpected, though. Step 6 essentially asks us to plan for emergence. But emergence, almost by definition, requires a rupture, maybe a paradigm shift, that you just can't slot into a pre-approved budget line or check off on some list of missing theories. When I stumbled upon the link in Fractals or Fish, my conclusions, like identifying the need to adjust certain disciplinary theories, which is a subsection of Step 9, they were reached through the hunch and the mantra, as I said, not through consciously adhering to some sequential rule set. And moreover, the steps still feel conceptually shallow when we get to the actual act of integration. The model fails, I think, to offer usable guidance on really complex synthesis, especially concerning Step 9G, which mandates understanding multiple causation and feedback loops.
It's easy enough to prescribe, understand how these dynamic systems interact, sure, but the framework doesn't actually provide any methodological tools. There's no guidance on systems thinking or dynamic modeling, or the other techniques you actually need to achieve that sophisticated synthesis. It just lists the required outcome.
But perhaps that very generality provides the necessary breadth. The value of these steps, I'd argue, is partly in their definitional rigor. The framework offers arguably the most precise definition of interdisciplinarity we have. ID is the performance of these steps, focusing on integrating across phenomena, theories, methods, and perspectives, not just disciplines per se. And this clarity is vital, particularly when we reach the communication stage, step 12. Communicating complex integrated results to diverse audiences, both scholarly and public, absolutely requires clarity of terminology. By grounding our work in a shared, structured methodology, using maybe universal lists of phenomena types and method types, we create a common semantic understanding. This approach makes cross-disciplinary communication much more robust and helps prevent misunderstandings rooted purely in disciplinary jargon.
Well, while I certainly desire that clarity, I have to challenge the, let's say, intellectual integrity of that process if it's misrepresented. If ID research is presented as if the steps were meticulously followed, when the actual discovery process was fundamentally intuitive, doesn't that risk masking the true innovative mechanism? It sort of creates a post hoc rationalization that misrepresents how the synthesis actually occurred. It could lead to what some might even call cargo cult science, following the outward form without grasping the underlying function. I think a better approach is simply intellectual honesty. Scholars should perhaps append reflections on the actual, often intuitive process they used. This acknowledges that while the formal scholarly presentation needs to be clear and concise, and yes, maybe using the structural steps as an organizational tool helps there, the generative mechanism itself remains rooted in that hunch and mantra.
By documenting both the rational structure and the creative flow, we can foster a continued honest conversation about methodology without sacrificing the formal requirements of scholarship.
Disciplinary work to its own standards. In the necessary pursuit of conceptual and methodological breadth, these guidelines ensure that critical aspects of depth, evidence evaluation, step 7 again, and bias critique are not accidentally sacrificed. The guidelines, I believe, ensure a robust, verifiable scholarly enterprise capable of standing up to the scrutiny it will inevitably face from the established disciplinary world.
I agree that scholarly standards are essential, absolutely. But the creative act of genuine integration, I still maintain, is inherently intuitive and ultimately resists reduction to a purely prescriptive list. The steps are valuable, yes, for reflection, for organization, for communication, I'll grant that. But the key to moving forward is really continuing the ongoing conversation among scholars about the process itself, recognizing that no single checklist can ever guarantee a breakthrough.
Well, our debate today certainly highlights the complexity inherent in doing ID research. We've clearly established two credible, evidence-based positions supporting both a highly structured, rule-based approach and also a more intuitive, maybe post-positivist methodology.
Exactly. And perhaps the ultimate measure of validity, at the end of the day, must remain whether the resulting analysis is genuinely scientific, rigorous, and effectively deals with the complex issues at hand.
So, as long as those necessary standards of science, verification, and critical evaluation are met by the chosen approach, then the initial choice of methodology, whether it starts with a formal checklist or an intuitive leap, is truly up to the researcher.